Hello, and welcome to All Things Chemical, a podcast produced by Bergeson and Campbell, a Washington, D.C. law firm focusing on chemical law, business, and litigation matters. I'm Lynn Bergeson. This week, I had the pleasure of speaking with Ryan Schmit, of counsel with BNC and senior regulatory consultant with the ACTA Group. Ryan joined our team a few weeks ago, and we wanted to show off our newest TSCA superstar. We discuss Ryan's illustrious career with EPA over the past 15 years. As you will hear, Ryan has been at the forefront of TSCA policy developments, Lautenberg legislative and agency implementation developments, new chemical determinations under TSCA, and OCSPP's evolving approach to PFAS strategy, among many other responsibilities. Now, here's my conversation with Ryan Schmit. Good morning, Ryan. It's great to be with you today. I've been so looking forward to introducing you to our listeners.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Lynn. It's really an honor to be on the podcast that I've listened to for many years now.
Well, it's nice of you to say that, and we've been looking forward to it. So maybe we can start out by just asking you to tell our listeners a little bit about yourself. I know you were not born in Washington, D.C. Actually, you were born in the Midwest, as was I, in Michigan. But tell us a little bit about your background and perhaps how you found your way to Washington.
Sure. Yes, I did grow up in the Midwest, about 600 or so miles from here, in a small town in northwestern Ohio called Delphus, which is absolutely very different from Washington, D.C.
I'll bet.
Delphus is famously known as America's friendliest city, says the sign at the edge of town. And I can really say I haven't found another place quite like it. It was a community full of good and kind and caring people. And I spent a lot of my childhood days outside, riding bikes and playing in fields and creeks and climbing trees and exploring. And my parents instilled in me a deep appreciation for the great outdoors. We did a fair amount of backpacking and canoeing when I was little, bird watching, just generally soaking up all the wonderful things that nature has to offer. They also stressed the importance of being a force for good in the world, and those two things really stuck with me and would eventually inspire me to pursue a career in environmental law. But But yeah, my Midwestern roots were very strong. I stayed in Ohio for school, both for undergrad at Miami University and then law school at the University of Cincinnati. And I married my high school sweetheart, Stephanie, who's just a lovely person and the love of my life. And we now have two delightful young children, Lillian, who's 5, and Robert, who will turn 8 on Thanksgiving.
Oh, no kidding. Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah. But until I got to law school, I really didn't know what exactly I wanted to do in the environmental space. And I know I've shared this story with you that I can remember very vividly an impassioned lecture that my environmental law professor gave on the Toxic Substances Control Act, or TSCA, and the famous corrosion-proof fittings case on asbestos, some of the exciting developments that were happening across the pond on chemicals law in the EU and REACH space, and how that was putting pressure on U.S. lawmakers here to make some legislative changes. And he made one comment that really stuck with me, about how some young environmental attorney could really make an entire career out of following just this one very dynamic area. And he ended up being right, and I was hooked. And so Washington, D.C. is the place that you go when you want to make a difference. And for me at that time, EPA was always the dream. And I was fortunate to be accepted into a program at the end of law school called the Presidential Management Fellowship, or PMF program. And that offers an expedited hiring pathway into the federal government. And I managed to convince folks at US EPA headquarters to give me a shot, and specifically the Office of Pollution Prevention and Toxics, which of course is the office with responsibility for implementing TSCA.
It's amazing that you had a professor, and he, presumably, I think you said it was he, spoke to you in a way that has been truly impactful for your life. I mean, not everyone is enamored with TSCA. It's a complicated statute, but to those of us here at Bergeson and Campbell, we love it because it offers this wonderful intersection of law, policy, and science. What in particular drove you to embracing a career both with EPA, but more specifically in the TSCA area? Did that confluence of topics speak to you, or was there something else?
It's a great question, Lynn, and I think, certainly the way that my professor described those issues just created that intellectual interest for me in terms of a law that had so much promise and was a sleeping giant of sorts, and the idea of being able to come to Washington D.C. and work on that law and try to make it work in the end was just something that was very attractive.
Well, I'm very glad that your professor gave you that lecture and it directed you to the point where we are now having this conversation. It's amazing. Brian, you have a long and very distinguished career with the EPA. Can you tell our listeners what you've been up to over the last 15 years?
Yeah, certainly. I started at EPA in OPPT's National Program Chemicals Division. And that division has since been reorganized, but they were in charge of managing national programs on chemicals like lead, mercury, asbestos, PBTs, formaldehyde. And when I walked in the door at EPA, it was just a month or two after EPA's new rules on lead-based paint had taken effect. And it was just such an incredible and overwhelming experience. It was a crash course for me of sorts on how regulatory program implementation works. And there was just so much to do. We were helping companies and workers getting trained and certified in performing lead safe work practices, answering compliance questions, interpreting how regulations would apply to specific fact scenarios, working with states who wanted to get authorized to run their own programs, navigating enforcement issues, collaborating with other partner federal agencies, and just so much more. And the people there were welcoming and amazing, and it was just a wonderful introduction to EPA. And then from there, my PMF role took me briefly on an assignment to the Department of Justice, which was also pretty incredible. It was just a totally different perspective. I was helping with all aspects of civil enforcement cases there under some of the big environmental statutes, things like the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, RCRA, and CERCLA. And it really gave me a better appreciation for the enforcement process, how those referrals do or do not get picked up by DOJ, and how important the factual record is. And really just the overall complexity of the process, the hard work that those attorneys put into each one of those cases. And I really definitely came away from that experience as a better writer and a more critical thinker. And then coming back to EPA after that, I definitely got back to work on TSCA. I ended up moving around over the years to different policy-oriented roles where I got exposure to the whole program, everything from new chemicals to existing chemical assessments and risk management, chemical testing, data collection, CBI, budget, IT. I kind of took on tasks wherever I was needed, leading rulemakings, developing guidance documents and policy statements, supporting litigation and enforcement actions, writing speeches and engaging with external stakeholders and everything in between. I was also able to absorb a fair amount of science knowledge from my very talented colleagues, disciplines like chemistry and risk assessment. And I was thinking about this last night. I think over the course of my 15 years there, I ended up supporting or advising 3 different assistant administrators across 3 different administrations, and I think at least 7 different office directors in OPPT as well.
Brian, that's impressive. That overarching view of not just TSCA, but clean air, clean water, and other environmental statutes, particularly has probably served your understanding of TSCA and some of the amendments to Lautenberg, given the issues that have been front and center and some of which are being litigated now. Also, your DOJ experience, were you actually embedded at DOJ or you were working as a liaison to OPPT to DOJ?
I was in the Environment and Natural Resources Division in their excuse me, in the Environmental and Natural Resources Division in their Civil Enforcement section. And I was there as a special attorney, so I wasn't directly liaison with OPPT. And at that point in time, at least, a lot more of the enforcement actions were on, the other environmental statutes. So
Right, right.
the others that I mentioned. But yeah, it
But what a
was,
fabulous experience to see the interaction between EPA and its outside counsel, the Department of Justice. That's great.
yeah, it was an incredible opportunity, and definitely gave me a better understanding of how that process works, and that relationship between EPA and other federal agencies and the nation's litigators, the Department of Justice.
Well, Ryan, your focus on TSCA will just be an enormous asset to our clients. And I know you were deeply involved in the legislative processes to amend TSCA in the 2014-2016 timeframe. And for those of us not in the government at that time, I can only imagine what was going on and how exciting it must have been. What was it like, and what was your role at that time in the Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention?
Yeah, so in 2014, I was back at EPA, and I was asked to go on detail to assist lawmakers on the House of Representatives side in crafting their TSCA reform bill. And I know that you know this well. The legislative discussions had been ongoing for many, many years prior to that. But in 2014, things were heating up on the Senate side and
Mm-hmm.
getting particularly serious. And so for me, this opportunity was just huge. The whole debate around fundamental flaws in TSCA is what grabbed my attention at law school. And so, being a part of the solution was one of the primary reasons I came to EPA and Washington, D.C. in the first place. And, when I was on the Hill, I sat with staff in the Energy and Commerce Committee, I think for a little over a year, working through various iterations of legislative text and participating in bipartisan negotiations, meetings with stakeholders to gain their perspectives. We hosted a number of substantive committee hearings, and I got to help shepherd the bill through subcommittee and full committee markups. And eventually, at the end of that, I was physically on the House floor and witnessed the bill, what was called the TSCA Modernization Act of
Mm-hmm.
2015, passing with a nearly unanimous vote. I think it was something like 398 to 1. And it was really just,
Wow.
it was such a
What a
thrill to be there. And
Yeah, what a historic moment. And you were there in the room.
indeed, but, of course, that wasn't the end of the story. After that, it was the Senate's turn, of course, and I returned to EPA to work for then Administrator Jim Jones, and to be a part of the small group of EPA staffers who were continuing to support TSCA reform efforts through technical assistance to Congress. So first to the Senate committee staff, and then eventually to the conference committee, who was charged with reconciling the House and Senate versions of the bills. So I was on cloud nine. There were a lot of many long nights, and fortunately, I had a very patient wife and no kids at that time. And just a fun side story. I was coming into EPA at that time via bike every day, and EPA's facilities locked down at a certain time each night. So if I was working late and I didn't get my bike out of that facility, it was basically jailed until the next day. And so during these TSCA reform days, I used to illegally walk my bike through the winding halls of the EPA buildings to be
It's a
able to
great image,
to
Ryan.
be able to get outside and go home. And it was Um, it was frowned upon. So if you ever visit EPA headquarters, and I'm sure you'll be back there, you'll notice, if you don't have to look far, there are just dozens of "No bike allowed" placards that are plastered all over, and they were tailor made for me,
Are
and
they there in your honor,
they were
Ryan?
tailor made for me. Yeah,
And that means you, Ryan Schmidt. No,
but
it's a great image, but I know you guys must have been just working your tails off at that time. It was just so extraordinarily busy, but exciting too, right? I mean, you were there at the forefront of one of the most important legislative developments for Tosca in over 4 decades.
absolutely, and that time was certainly one of the highlights of my career. And no one on our EPA team ever really complained about the long hours or the
Oh,
or the
no.
stress. And the feeling amongst that team was that, as you mentioned, Congress was on the cusp of this enormous achievement in environmental law, and we all just wanted to support that effort in whatever ways we could.
It's hard to believe that that was over 10 years ago. I mean, the law, of course, was passed in just about 10 years ago, but in the 2014, 2015 timeframe when the House version was getting enacted, it seems like yesterday to me. I can remember speaking with Jim Jones from time to time about, the progress that was being made. And his role, if I recall correctly, Brian, was that of a technical advisor to the Hill. Is that correct? And you probably helped him in preparing for briefings and providing counsel and specific content on various provisions. I mean, you were right there aiding the then assistant administrator to help move this legislative, you know, juggernaut forward. That must have been just an extraordinary experience, especially since Tosca was one of the reasons you went to law school and went to EPA. What an opportunity.
Absolutely, absolutely, and yes, I mean Jim was very instrumental in helping move that conversation forward, making sure that the resources of EPA were at the disposal of lawmakers, who were very busy trying to sort out the compromise that became Tosca.
Hmm. Well, that deep background gives you an extraordinarily textured and nuanced appreciation for what is now, Lautenberg. So I'm really, really glad to hear that you were right in the center of everything and helping Jim and EPA and others move the legislative vehicle forward. But once it was enacted in June of 2016, I imagine you rotated back to a different role within the Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention and helped EPA face the extraordinary challenges that were probably front and center. Can you share what it was like to be in OPPT and OCSPP right when the law was passed? I imagine no 2 days were alike, and it was just crazy busy, both exhilarating and maybe a little daunting.
It was crazy. I remember being at this signing ceremony at the White House on the day that Tosca became law, and it was surreal. There was the president was there, obviously, and lawmakers and all of these major Tosca stakeholder groups that had worked, so long and so hard to see this day. And we walked out of, the EPA crew walked out of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue and back the few short
Hmm.
blocks to EPA headquarters up the road, and came into the building, and it just sort of hit, I think, for
Right.
several of us, that the entire world for OPPT folks was completely different. The changes in Lautenberg to the old law were just so broad and sweeping. And for the hundreds of people who worked in OPBT, some of whom who had been there for 30 or more years,
Hmm.
it was this brand new law essentially to implement new requirements and new responsibilities, new words and phrases to understand and apply. So it was crazy, and there was definitely a lot of excitement. People knew that. these changes were coming, and there was a lot of, I think, optimism for what changes to TSCA could mean for EPA's ability to advance health protections for communities across the country. But as you noted, I think there was a lot of anxiety as well. Everyone had certainly had a lot of questions. I think, rightfully so. So we spent a great deal of time, particularly in those first few days and weeks, educating, helping people in OPPT to understand all of the changes that just transpired, and not just the what, but the why, to try to give everyone some context for what these changes would mean for our work going forward.
I'm guessing working with Jim was helpful. He had such extraordinary experience implementing the Food Quality Protection Act in 1996 because he was there for that implementation as well. So his experience, his calm, his great management style. You were lucky to have such an experienced assistant administrator at the time, and he's such a nice guy.
For sure. Yeah, he was a great boss and a great mentor. So I was very fortunate there. One particular aspect of the changes to Tosca that was challenging was that those changes were effective immediately. So there wasn't much time to spare, and we all set to work pretty quickly. And day one included, for example, significant changes to a lot of different parts of OPPT's business. New chemicals, for example, were immediately subject to these brand new requirements for EPA to make a determination before chemicals can enter commerce. Within 6 months, risk evaluations needed to be underway for 10 existing chemicals, which was a nearly unthinkable workload for a team that had only really assessed a handful of existing chemicals in the decades prior. And then within 1 year, TSCA required EPA to finalize three key framework rulemakings to establish procedures for prioritizing the 86,000 or so chemicals in commerce for risk evaluation. And then a second rule for the procedures for actually carrying out those risk evaluations, consistent with the law's new requirements for science. And then a third rule to reset the TSCA inventory to better distinguish between chemicals that were active or inactive in U.S. commerce. For anyone that knows anything about rulemakings in the federal government, you know that proposed and final rules happen over the course of many years, not one. So that was a big task. And then another significant challenge was that these massive increases in responsibility for OPPT were never met with a comparable bump in appropriated resources. And that challenge remains true today, despite some very heroic efforts over the years to get more funding for the program. So I think, really for many at EPA and myself included, that day in June of 2016 felt like the start of a race to catch up that has never really ended.
The fact that there was no transition period has been the subject of just endless discussion. And I know that wasn't an oversight, Ryan, but was it talked about internally about, okay, once June 22nd, 2016, when President Obama signed the legislation and we were literally off to the races. I know as a practitioner, that hit me like a ton of bricks, in the days following June. It's like, oh my God, the law is in place. And as you just noted, EPA was busy writing these significant rules, getting them out for public comment. That metaphor we used so often back then is building an airplane while you were in flight. That sense, again, of all of the challenges and all of the responsibilities that had to be met with limited resources and an extraordinary regulatory burden on existing staff must have been both exhilarating, exhausting, and a little intimidating. How did you manage, getting that all done as a team? Because you did. I mean, I think the Obama administration and Jim Jones got everything out by the end of that year, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, I mean, it was a massive team effort. I mean, everybody, like I said, everyone knew these changes were coming, and everyone was prepared to act on day one. And the necessary priorities were set, within EPA, and I think with leadership in the Obama administration, it was understood that it was important to meet these new requirements and to stay timely. And
You also work very closely with professionals in the new chemical program, working TSCA Section 5 issues, which is an area that was controversial then in 2016 and remains so today. Could you tell me a little bit more about what it is you were doing in the Section 5 program with the new chemicals program?
I mean, the new chemicals program has definitely had its challenges over the years, and it really began, as I mentioned, with implementing some of those new requirements on day one. So for any of the chemicals that were in EPA's review queue on June 22nd, the program had to re-review those submissions to ensure that they comported with the new requirements in TSCA. And while we were doing that, new submissions were continuing to come in, and as a result, a backlog was born. And
Right.
it's one that EPA really hasn't been able to shake since. But a lot of the most immediate issues that we tackled were pretty basic. They were fundamental questions like, what did the phrase "conditions of use" mean? This new phrase in TSCA, and how did that impact the scope of new chemical assessments? And what do each of those new 5 affirmative determinations mean? And under what circumstances should EPA be making those determinations? All of these decisions had to be written down under the new law, and there was the questions of what should those documents look like? What level of documentation and support was necessary for those new actions, the new determinations. So a lot of the practical issues we discussed internally and eventually addressed, at least at a high level, in this working approach document that's published on EPA's website. But the program's approach in the new chemicals division has continued to evolve over the years, and I think it's been challenging to find an equilibrium and a rhythm to those reviews.
Has it surprised you, Ryan, that the actions taken in 2016 are the subject of discussion now in late 2025? Because to those of us in the TSCA space, when I looked at the revisions to Section 5 of TSCA, I was surprised that they were as extensive as they are. So I can imagine that you had a lot of internal stakeholders and colleagues saying, gee, Ryan, help me understand what type of documentation I need. How are these provisions interpreted? I mean, were you providing that type of internal counsel to your colleagues at EPA and writing these guidance documents and laying the foundation for complying and implementing what I think are extensive changes to TSCA Section 5, changes that I did not anticipate?
We certainly did. I mean, it was a team effort to try to unpack these new requirements and what they'd mean for the program. And it all of the changes in the new chemicals program have given host to a whole new set of issues. The speed and efficiency of EPA's review, of course, is a common theme. I mean, as you well know, reviews often extend well beyond the 90 days contemplated in TSCA. But there are other issues like whether the frequency of regulatory outcomes is appropriate. There were generally fewer chemicals being restricted prior to Lautenberg than there are now.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Folks have different perspectives on whether the agency's current approach is an improvement for health and the environment, or whether those restrictions are unintended and unnecessary burdens. And there's been questions about whether EPA's scientific approaches and assumptions are sound, and things like whether the public should have a greater opportunity to participate in the review process. So it's been a constant stream of debate on what the changes were intended to mean for the Tosca New Chemicals program, and whether EPA has hit its mark in finding that balance that can ensure both the protections against unreasonable risks from new chemicals, but also provide the incentive for companies to innovate the greener and safer chemistries.
Just making a note to self here to have you and Rich Engler on a future podcast to talk about, the new chemicals program and its evolution over the past now. It's just astonishing that it's been a decade, but I think a lot of progress has been made and there's much greater clarity and courses of conduct. But boy, in the beginning, it was pretty confusing for sure.
Yeah, agreed. And there was this significant amount of time spent trying to catch up and reduce that backlog, and the agency's done a lot of good things, as you note, like improving the efficiency and the steps in the process, creating some templated language for various regulatory and assessment documents, modernizing some of our scientific models and methods, SOPs, and creating opportunities to reduce what EPA calls rework, where new information sort of results in the agency having to redo portions of its risk assessments again, and then just creating processes for resolving the situations where our EPA scientists have different opinions, and how to move forward in that way.
It's hard to predict the future, but there could be more legislative action down the road. Maybe, maybe not. We'll see. You'll just be working on those aspects from a different perch, Ryan.
I look forward to it.
Let's pivot to another really, really timely topic, and that's PFAS. It's an area of major focus for our clients. We are anxiously awaiting the new proposed PFAS TSCA Section 8A7 reporting rule, which reportedly cleared OMB not too long ago. You served as OCSPP lead on PFAS actions, including representing the Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention on the agency's PFAS Council. You helped develop EPA's PFAS strategic roadmap, among other actions. Tell us more about your experience at EPA on PFAS.
Well, PFAS is one of those unique areas of bipartisan agreement, and I think almost everyone shares some level of concern about PFAS. It's a class of chemicals that sticks around forever. It's showing up in the blood of people and animals around the world. And there are, demonstrated links between certain PFAS exposures and adverse health impacts. So it's been a priority focus at EPA across multiple different administrations. The PFAS Council was a group of senior agency officials across EPA that were assembled to help think through a whole of agency approach to tackling this PFAS problem, and to provide a forum for policy dialogue and coordination. And it was first chaired by the assistant administrator in EPA's Office of Water, and then later by my former boss, AA for OCSPP, Michal Friedhoff. And like you mentioned, I was OCSPP's representative, helping to bring forward the perspectives and ideas, and keeping others at EPA apprised of our ongoing efforts. So the council was also engaged with our broader federal family through a PFAS interagency policy committee that was led by CEQ. Well, I would say that a big part of EPA's PFAS work in both the Trump and Biden administrations involved taking stock of our existing statutory and regulatory authorities and identifying the options for things like better researching PFAS to understand its risks, options to help prevent exposures through regulatory restrictions, and then how to use those authorities to remediate sites that were already contaminated. So all of those ideas manifested in the PFAS action plan in 2019, and then later in the PFAS strategic roadmap in 2021. And those documents have really guided federal efforts on PFAS up to this day. So OCSBP has had a few contributions that I just highlight quickly here. One was a significant new use rule, or a SNUR, for more than 300 inactive PFAS. So these are chemicals that are no longer active in U.S. commerce. And this rule basically guarantees an opportunity for EPA to review and impose restrictions on those chemicals should anyone want to start making them again. We also developed a framework for reviewing and managing new PFAS chemicals in the new chemicals program. So things like testing requirements that may be required and risk management approaches to help minimize future releases. You mentioned the PFAS reporting rule, which EPA is now in the process of revising, but that rule is expected to bring in more information and data on PFAS to inform EPA's future assessments and actions. And there was a PFAS national testing strategy, which was announced at the same time as the strategic roadmap. That was intended to organize this massive universe of thousands of PFAS chemicals into distinct subgroups or categories, and then leverage some of our testing authorities under TSCA to require development of data and ultimately better characterize and distinguish hazards associated within each of those categories.
It's an extraordinary body of work, Ryan, that both the Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention, the initiatives you just enumerated, and all of the other PFAS-related activities under clean air, clean water, the Lands Division, the RCRA proposed rules that came out, the CERCLA listing of PFOA and PFOS as hazardous substances. Just an extraordinary body of work, and EPA and all of its offices are to be congratulated for working so comprehensively and thoroughly on these issues. And it's continued even with the change of administration. PFAS continues to be a priority, and I'm guessing, maybe you have a different view, that it will continue to be an area of research and regulatory activity for years to come.
It certainly remains a focus, and all of EPA's important work in that space will no doubt, I think, continue into the foreseeable future, just given the scope and magnitude of the issue. We we used to say that addressing forever chemicals is kind of a forever job.
I think that's true, and it's here at BNC we deal with it at the EPA level, FDA level, state level, and what's going on in Europe and elsewhere are all keeping our clients deeply engaged in PFAS mapping and supply chain initiatives. So it's all good, but it's also very, very, very busy and very diverse. The diversity of approaches has been the subject of endless discussion, and I'm sure you're anxious to get involved in some of those activities on behalf of our clients. I'm guessing after spending 15 years with a lot of really wonderful people at EPA, it was bittersweet to leave. Do you wish to share any reflections on, when you did actually say goodbye and how you're maintaining those relationships now that you're in private practice?
Yeah, it has been bittersweet, and I think I really will be forever grateful for all of those years. For the many people that gave me various opportunities, for the colleagues that helped me learn and grow, and certainly for the many friends that I made there and continue to have. I think the next several years at EPA and in OPPT will be particularly difficult. There's so much uncertainty in the TSCA implementation space around all of the pending legal challenges, but I'm confident in dedicated career staff and managers and OPPT that are still there. I'm confident that they will find ways to persist and prevail and continue to carry out the agency's important mission. I did a lot of reflecting before I made my own personal decision, and the time was right for me to make that change. And I'm absolutely thrilled to be a part of Ferguson and Campbell and the ACTA Group teams, but I'll definitely miss the camaraderie and people at EPA. But I haven't gone far, and I'm very excited to remain a part of the TSCA conversation in this new role in the private sector.
As are we, Ryan. Well, you'd mentioned all the uncertainty, both in TSCA implementation legally and regulatorily, given the litigation and change of administration and just a lot of moving parts. What advice generally do you have for TSCA stakeholders who are interested in working with EPA and other stakeholders to make TSCA more efficient and effective? Any parting thoughts that you can share with us?
You know, I think they'll find a very receptive audience. My experience is that everyone at EPA really shares those same goals of making the law work. People may have different perspectives on what effective implementation of TSCA means, of course. But my advice to stakeholders would be to approach conversations with EPA with some ideas towards solutions, particularly ideas or solutions that stay within the letter and spirit of the law. I think it's important to recognize the enormity of the task that EPA is facing, and where possible, try to muster some patience and understanding, even when the situation might be frustrating, and look to EPA as a partner rather than an adversary. And I think you'll find the result to be better almost every time if you do that.
Great advice, Ryan, and definitely shares kind of our operating philosophy here that we work better as a team, that we can have our respectful differences of opinion, and that's, our job is always to advocate on behalf of our clients, but working together and collegially and creatively always gets us closer to yes sooner than the alternative.
Can't agree more.
Thank you so much for joining us today. I just so look forward to working with you on these and other issues. The breadth of your experience, your familiarity with the legislative underpinnings and implementation of TSCA, definitely an invaluable asset to the firm and to ACTA. So thank you for sharing some time with us today, and I look forward to our clients and friends getting to know you better.
Looking forward to it, and thanks again for having me, Lynn.
You bet. Thanks again to Ryan Schmit for speaking with me today about his career with EPA's Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention, and learning about the many ways Ryan's TSCA expertise and insight will be put to excellent use here at Ferguson and Campbell. All Things Chemical is produced by Jackson Bierfeld at Bierfeld Audio, LLC. We will be back again soon to further inform and entertain you about all things chemical. Bye-bye.